For those of you who don't know me, I'm Lionel Barber. I'm the editor of the Financial Times. I've been in my post for the last 10 years, served in Brussels 6 wonderful years in the 1990s, and in America for 10 years in Washington and New York. We have a great panel today on an important subject regarding the world after the global financial crisis. And I was thinking timing is everything, and it must be almost 7 years to the day that Lehman Brothers, the Wall Street investment bank, that many people thought was bulletproof, actually collapsed, leading to the near meltdown of the global financial system. And over the next 7 years, some people have likened this experience to being in wartime. I speak guardedly in this particular part of the world, but this was a central bank governor who said, you know, if you think of the number of casualties in this crisis, you think of the extraordinary measures that we've taken to rescue the financial system, you'll understand that this is an incredible period that we're living through. Now, 7 years on, let's just take a look around the world where we are. I would argue that we still have not returned to normality. We're still living in extraordinary times. We still have record low interest rates in Europe and in the United States. There's no sign of the Federal Reserve moving in September. It might, but events in China have maybe stayed their hand. If you look at the banking system, hundreds of billions of dollars have been poured into it. Some banks stronger, but in Europe, arguably, still hasn't actually faced up to many of the problems facing the banks. They're undercapitalized. They've still got risk there. So that's having an effect, an important effect. If you look at the sovereign debt crisis, after months of negotiations, Greece did indeed have a bailout plan accepted. We've still got to see what happens in a Greek election, but that has been a searing experience for all participants. And in my view, at least, the Greek problem has been managed but not solved. If you then look at the question of which this panel is going to address, the question of economic growth, it's still historically very low in Europe. The question that I'm going to ask this panel is whether Europe is consigned to terminally tepid growth as a result of a failure to reform, failure to pursue the kind of intense partnerships or imaginative partnerships that might galvanize the strength of the collective as opposed to the individual. But this is a real problem because low growth, low employment. And then finally, external factors. For most of the summer, every time I went to a conference, I was asked, which is more important, Greece or China? And Madam Ambassador, you know the answer. I said China. And this was at the moment, many people thought Greece was actually going to leave the euro. I never quite believed it was going to leave the euro, but I certainly understood that China was acutely important as it engages in this historic effort to move from an investment-led to a consumption-dominated economy without affecting aggregate demand. And the latest events in China, and I don't want to speak for the ambassador, but really when China, it used to be the case if America sneezed, everybody else got a cold. Well, right now, if China sneezes, we might get flu. It's journalistic license. So we have an immensely complicated and complex world in which to make policy. And fortunately, we have a distinguished panel here of, as I say, practitioners, experts who are either at the coalface or in the furnace. So, to begin with, I think it would be very useful to ask, let me just actually, before I pick him out, I just want to go through the panel. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to meet just beforehand, but I'm going to go through. This is going to be a major task, by the way, trying to get a good discussion with 8 people plus a moderator. I'll do my best. So, to my immediate right, excuse me, Mr. Janko Medja, who is president of the management board of NLB Slovenia, the key bank in Slovenia. Privatization, we're going to have an interesting conversation about that. Then, next, further right, not in a political sense, of course, is Miss Isabel Grilo, who is the head of unit for structural reforms, competitiveness and innovation at DG Economic Affairs in Brussels. We then, wait a minute, here we have Mr. Vedran Sošic, who is Vice Governor of the Croatian National Bank. Sorry we didn't get a chance to meet too, but look forward to your remarks, sir. Then, as everybody saw, the Minister of Finance for the Republic of Slovenia, Mr. Dušan Mramor, Michael Noonan, Irish Finance Minister, then Senator Benedetto, Della, Vedova, State Secretary, Minister of Foreign Affairs, almost finished. And then Madam Ambassador Yanyi Yang, who's the head of mission People's Republic of China, and then Richard Koo, who is the head of the chief economist Nomura Research Institute. Phew. Fine, let's start. Michael Noonan. Michael Noonan is the Irish Finance Minister. He's been dealing with probably the most serious economic and financial crisis that the country has ever faced. First of all, give us a sense of where Ireland is now, and then tell us a bit about how much your progress has been owed to, or is owed to your own efforts, and how much to your partners in Brussels and, dare I say, Frankfurt with the European Central Bank. Michael Noonan.
Thanks very much, Lionel. I suppose to answer your 2 questions, you need to get a sense of where Ireland came from over the first 8 years of the millennium. There was a massive building boom based on Irish greed and cheap money from Europe as a result of being part of the euro. The capacity of the building and development industry went way beyond what was required by the economy. And when the supply of second-hand property was strained, the builders provided a lot of new property, even though macroeconomically it wouldn't have been necessary in the economy. So people, including people who know nothing about property, decided that the best way to get rich was to buy property, and we'd all sell it to each other at inflated prices, and everyone would get rich together. And it was great while it lasted. You had people like medical consultants using their spare money to become landlords, investing in offices and hotels and houses. You had SMEs, instead of reinvesting their profits in the core business that they understood, establishing property portfolios, because it was much easier to make money on property than in the core business that they were good at. So that was grand until Lehman Brothers went down in 2008, and then people began to worry about the quality of the collateral that was underpinning all these loans that were right across the economy. And values dropped like a stone. And when they dropped, of course, the banks became insolvent. Now, because of the level of the activity, the national budgets were dependent on transactional taxes coming from the building industry, income tax from the building workers, PRSI from social insurance on the building workers, VAT from the transactions. Every 10,000 houses threw up $1 billion in tax. So when house building dropped from 100,000 to 30,000, there was a 7 billion hole in the national budget. So what started as a banking problem, triggered by what I've described, it immediately connected to a sovereign problem. So not only did the banks go bust, but the sovereign went bust as well. And it struggled on from 2008 into 2009, but it was quite clear then that we weren't going to get funded in the market any longer, and there came a point where we were excluded from the markets, and if it hadn't been for the support of our partners in Europe and the support of the IMF, we'd have been in enormous difficulty, even worse than what we were in, because the support from Europe and from the IMF allowed us to make the necessary adjustments over a 3-year period. If we had to do it overnight in one fell swoop, it would be absolutely devastating, both economically and socially. So that's the background. Then to get to your questions, we had a program with the involvement of the IMF, the Commission and the European Central Bank. They established a troika. They negotiated a program with our predecessors in government. We renegotiated it. And the system was very simple. You got a series of tasks that had to be completed in a 3-month period. And the troika came to Dublin after 3 months and they checked were the tasks completed. And that went on over 3 years. Over the 3 years, we completed 270 separate actions. Everything from raising taxes to cutting expenditure, including cutting public service pay by almost 20% to balance the budget. We recapitalised the banks, and then we did innumerable structural interventions to get the economy working properly again. In parallel with that, and driven by the Department of Finance, we had a parallel programme for the sectoral development of the economy. There are 14 sectors in our economy. 2 of them are public service. The other 12, we took them sector by sector. And because we had no money to do any kind of Keynesian demand side initiative, we concentrated on the supply side. And we have now got all the sectors growing again. 12 of the 14 sectors, the 2 being the public sector, have put on extra jobs over the last 2 years. The public sector, we're sweating down jobs anywhere there. That was part of the adjustment policy. So we dropped about 20% of GDP. Our unemployment went over 15%, and hundreds of thousands of young people immigrated. And we're really in a bad way. But the medicine has worked. Last year we grew at 5.2% net. This year we're going to exceed 5.5. It'll be 5.4, 5.2, somewhere in that neighbourhood at year end. And we're looking at growth rates of between 3.5% and 4% for the next 5 or 6 years. And we're planning on that basis. Our deficit has come down from enormous amounts. I'll be bringing a deficit in this October, beginning with a 1. I think at the end of this year we'll be either at 2 or just below 2. So somewhere in the mid-1s will be the deficit for next year. Our GDP last year exceeded what it was at the top of the Celtic Tiger. So we're back with, the macro numbers are right again.
So you mentioned the Celtic Tiger. What's it become now? A well-behaved pussycat, or?
I don't think we have any animal metaphors anymore. People are very chastened. The last statistic I wanted to give is the debt peaked at 123% of GDP. And we'll have it under 100 after the October budget.
That's amazing.
And the European average now for the Eurozone is just under 95. Yeah. But of course, they're still too high. The European average is too high as well.
That's true. But Michael, can you there were some fantastic statistics there that 20% drop in GDP, unemployment up at 15%, living standards. In the public sector, people took wage cuts of what percent?
It varied depending on their grade, but the maximum was 20%.
So there was a huge drop in living standards. Yeah.
We were lucky in one sense that inflation was so low.
Yeah.
If inflation had been higher, it would have put tremendous pressure on living standards.
Right.
But we're at the stage now where we have the resources to begin to restore some of what we took.
And in terms of the partnership, Michael, with the European Central Bank now, you've benefited from these low interest rates and the assistance to the banks, but you're back in the market, financial markets, aren't you?
Yeah, we're back in the markets. We got
to be able to borrow.
We got 30-year money at 1.3 earlier in the year. Our 10-year is quite low now. In our ranking order, we're inside Spain and Italy, and inside all the countries that have problems as well. So we're kind of focusing on Middle Europe now, where we say Belgium, in terms of the markets being the kind of country that we're closing in on, in terms of our 10-year rates.
So the patient is definitely on the road to recovery, but to get
there's one last point worth making. There's no popular way or easy way of making financial adjustments. There's no popular way of doing it. I mean, there has been about 80 financial crises in the world since 1975. There's no popular way of doing it. There's no easy way of doing it. And if you, in the business I'm in, of politics, if you want to do it with some level of political success, you have to start very early on. And you have to hope that over a 5-year spread, you come out the other side and that you can start to restore the fortunes of your electorate. But if you wait, you're going to get absolutely nailed. And that has happened in other countries as well. And I'm not saying we'll succeed either, but we're not badly positioned with the electorate at present.
I think that's a very important point about waiting. I could think of a couple of countries that won't, of course, be named in this distinguished gathering that have definitely waited and waited too long and then being caught, the situation being much, much worse. Isabel, would you like to comment a little bit on what Michael Noonan has been saying about the role of European partners to help a country in difficulty? From your perspective in Brussels, where have you seen good progress, good examples, and where do you think there's more to be done?
Thank you for the opportunity to share our views on this subject. Indeed, I thought it was very keenly observed that the political economy of some of these measures and some of these reforms is an extremely important aspect that is often overlooked when we take it from a very technical perspective, and in particular the timing and the fact of doing it in the beginning of a mandate has proved to be crucial. And as you said, we have some examples where dragging on some of these reforms is...
I didn't say France. I just want to
I didn't mention any country either, and in some cases...
We won't make Good.
And when you speak about partnerships, as you know, when we exchanged some mails, for me it was not very, very clear what kind of partnerships we were talking about. But in this context of reforms or of measures that have to be taken to address the consequences of the financial crisis, but also the consequences of pre-crisis lack of measures or lack of action that have been kind of hidden by favorable conditions elsewhere that have masked already very important structural aspects that I think it's important to stress that it's not just what happened since 2008 that is the, let's say, the consequence of that is the responsible for what we see now in some member states, in some countries, that there was already a built-in of important imbalances and structural problems that were there. So let's not forget that. And what I would stress as important, let's call it, aspects of partnerships is in particular the streamlining and the setup, let's say, of the so-called European semester, so an effort to coordinate and to give some impulse to reforms that are needed in the different member states, which has been recently streamlined in view of the recognition that we need further efforts to deepen EMU. Some of you may have remembered the so-called Lisbon strategy. That was a very first and very soft approach. I think it's now, with the European semester, a more solid approach. And we have seen for some countries that have to...
This was in 2000, the Lisbon Agenda.
Yes, Lisbon, yeah, exactly.
When the so-called vision of making Europe the most competitive
economy in the world,
by 2010. Thank you.
Well, I
need any more be said?
I reframed some.
You called it soft. I would say it was. Anyway, go on. Carry on.
Anyway, and then, of course, when you ask about what we have witnessed in terms of relative progress in these reforms, by and large, when we look across country, I would say that those countries that have been under financial assistance have shown a much faster pace of reform adoption. Yeah. And when we look across, let's say, policy areas, we see that one area where there is some slow movement in general is structural reforms, and in particular product market reforms. Our insights, both from, let's say, the monitoring of reforms in the context of the European semester, so that covers the 28 member states, and also looking then with more depth into the reform efforts for countries under financial assistance, what we see is that besides the, let's say, first steps for adoption of a certain number of reforms, then the implementation is crucial. And where we often see a lack of progress is in this step from the pure adoption or drafting of a legislative piece to its real implementation, both in terms of final adoption in the, let's say, legislative process, and then on the ground implementation in terms of some other pieces of action that are needed at different levels of the government. And that.
But just on structural reforms, just to be clear, could you perhaps be very specific about 2 or 3 structural reforms that you can, in Brussels, consider to be very, very important, but where member states have perhaps not been as quick to adopt?
Well, one of the areas where we think there has not been enough progress, and yet everything, I think, was on the ground and started quite early, is all the reforms in the services sector. As we know, with the Service Directive that was adopted in 2006, that was to be implemented by 2009, and we are still monitoring, and we are still dragging, and we are still making recommendations in that area, and we are now preparing, as you know, a forthcoming strategy on the internal market for goods and services, but where services feature very prominently. And what we see there is that very many member states have dragged their feet on the implementation of this directive. And we have seen a few examples where actually ambition has gone beyond the service directive requirements. and others where there has been some, I don't want to talk about gold plating, but where basically they've been trying to work around it, and to some extent we also see the harm that this has done in terms of economic performance.
Okay, that's really helpful. I'm going to come back to a couple of questions later, but I think just staying with this European policy coordination, then I'm going to move to Central Europe and the Balkan experience here on partnerships and economic reform. But I do want to just ask Senator Benedetto Della Vedova about his perspective, particularly on, and I suppose without wanting to speak for Italy, because I am, after all, English, my impression sometimes, having watched Italy, is, you know, it's such a strong, got such a strong entrepreneurial base, particularly in northern Italy. But at the same time, Italy really does and has benefited from, you know, external cover, external political cover to make difficult political decisions in Europe. But please, Senator, what's your perspective in terms of economic reform, economic policy coordination in Europe, and what's needed?
Thank you very much. As you said, Italy has a very big and strong industrial base that was one of the demonstration of this is that during the crisis, even when the euro was higher than it is now, the exports of Italy scored more or less like Germany exports. So this was one of the point one of the good point of the economic performance of Italy during the years of crisis. But we are suffering, we suffered, and we are still suffering a lot of a lack of domestic demand. And we are trying, and with the next budget, we will try to do to make room for tax cuts to improve the domestic demand, and we are trying to avoid the trade-off between austerity and pro-growth policies. If there were such a trade-off between austerity and pro-growth policies, one could easily solve the problem expanding public expenditure. But we know perfectly that it's not possible to expand public expenditure. First of all, because probably in the medium-long term it doesn't work. Secondly, or firstly, because we need the confidence of the market, because we are a very heavy indebted country.
130% of GDP.
Yeah. Well, we was on the market also during the tougher period of the crisis in November 2011, but with a spread in the interest rates compared to the German bonds that rose around 500, 600 basis points. Now, after Monti, after Letta, and now with the Renzi government, we are about 120, something like that, basis points. So that it's important for us, of course. We avoid to have the Troika and IMF in Rome. That was important, but we think that in EU is not possible to design one-size-fits-all policies, because, for instance, we are impressed of the progress and of the faster recovery of Ireland. Ireland is not Greece, better or not, but maybe the weather is better in Greece, the governments is better in Ireland. I think that we must ask to each single country what he is reasonably able to do. And one of the key issues for us is time. You can have the same goals, but you can't ask all the countries to reach the same goals in the same time. And in our perspective, the demand for flexibility is a demand of time, because we know perfectly that is not an EU request to reduce our public debt. It's in the Italian national interest to reduce the public debt, of course. Reducing the public debt is a matter of reducing the public expenditure, of course, but is a matter of growth. We need to improve our growth rate that was and still is, even if in 2015 we will have a plus sign before the growth rate, probably 0.7, 0.8, something like that. Of course, we ask flexibility and some more time, but we know perfectly that to have more time and flexibility is a reasonable request only if we can demonstrate that we are on a path of structural reforms, and is exactly what the Italian government led by Mr. Renzi is trying, no, is not trying, is doing. Institutional reforms, economical reforms, on supply side reforms. We did a great job on labor market, for instance, and we are seeing some good results after a few months. That not means for the moment to improve employment. It's not enough to have a good labor market reform to have improvement in the figures of employment. But, for instance, definitely we got in few months a better employment with the new contracts, more stable, and the trade-off was now is more, with the new contracts, is more easy to fire, of course, but for the companies there is a sort of push to hire with stable contracts, not as it was before, that we had contracts where it was not possible to fire, and so the companies tried to hire with exceptions contracts. So reforms we need reforms to have our debt sustainable in the medium and long term. We have to cut taxes because we need to boost domestic demand. Yeah. And what we are trying to do is to use the flexibility that we are asking to Brussels to reduce taxes and to implement our economic reforms, and in the meanwhile to cut public expenditure. Of course, as she said, reforms is not only an issue of good piece of legislations. We know perfectly that, for instance, in the last 20 years in Italy, we had a lot of more or less good reforms, but we experimented a dramatic lack in the implementation of good reforms.
Well, and that, and also, just to be clear, if I asked you what Italy's growth record has been since entering the euro, it has been less than 1% per year. I mean, it's barely grown. It's even worse than that.
Yeah.
So how much time do you need?
Well, I think that in the last 12 months we did a great job. And we are expecting growth. Of course, growth, it depends also on what is going on in the world.
Well, yeah. We'll come to China in a minute.
Yeah. But we are on the path of recovering and to have stable growth. Maybe not enough, but reasonably better than in the past. But our effort, in conclusion, is to have good reforms implemented. That means good piece of legislation, of course, means the cooperation of the public sector, and we are trying to do a big effort in this. And third, you need the confidence and the cooperation of entrepreneurs, trade unions, and the public opinion at large. Last point, we are trying to push in the direction of a wider, to open more our economy. In both directions, we are pushing our companies to invest abroad, and because we have a lot of medium and small-sized enterprises, we are trying to help them to go abroad, to grow with direct investments abroad, to serve the regional markets in Far East Asia, but also in Eastern Europe, and we are trying to attract more foreign investments.
Right.
And what I can say that when the investors saw reforms are more keen to invest. And in 2014, we received a lot of foreign direct investment.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much for that snapshot of the Italian economy and its challenges. I think it's important to now move to this region. And starting with the Minister of Finance of Slovenia, I mean, I would be interested in hearing from you how Slovenia has benefited from EU membership in terms of galvanizing economic reform, and how far, also second, you feel that Slovenia can benefit from regional partnership, regional economic integration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Slovenia was in a bit different situation than Ireland at the beginning of this crisis, and there were contradicting views on whether fundamentals of Slovenia are safe and sound, or these fundamentals are ailing. And I know that we had debates, and I was proponent of those who said that Slovenia has very good fundamentals and that it has a very competitive export sector, but it made mistakes in the financial sector. I would say, in general, I was right, others were wrong, of course, as we can see now, with 3% growth in 2014 and at the moment 2.7% growth this year. But I must say that the diagnosis of what has to be done in Slovenia by European Commission was right. They put pressure on Slovenia by putting Slovenia into two procedures: excessive deficit procedure, which comes, of course, quite automatically when you are out of 3% deficit, and then the other excessive macroeconomic imbalances procedure, which was sort of, I would say, arbitrary for Slovenia, and it was just additional pressure to make structural changes, which Slovenia was unable to do at the beginning of crisis. From 2009 to 2013, first half of the year 2013, we had a complete political block. We couldn't do any changes, really. The three governments changed in this period. Of course, these changes were unpopular, had to be unpopular. But once this blockade was overcome in 2013, and all the changes that had to be made, like change of constitution concerning referendum, because referendums were stopping structural reforms, And when this was changed, and pension reform went through, and labor market reform, and then capitalizing banking system, and everything what had to be done, it proved that when this part of the economy was restructured, that these fundamentals, really good fundamentals of business sector, especially in export area, came into play, and Slovenia started growing again. So pressure from European Commission was the right one. We were fighting back at the beginning, saying that the European Commission has a wrong diagnosis and that we shouldn't go this path, austerity path.
You actually challenged them?
Not myself, because I was not finance minister at that time, but previous finance ministers fought with them quite a lot. Mm-hmm. And sometimes he was right, sometimes he was wrong. So, but in general, I would say that this was very good partnership. And at the end, when these results started to show, with deleveraging, let's say we were in 2012, we had the leverage of business sector at 96% of GDP. This was way above European average. Now it's at 73%, way below European average. When deleveraging process started to kick in, labor market flexibility helped from the supply side and so on, the results came into view, and really good results. On the other hand, I would say that this partnership, EU partnership or coordination, let's call it coordination, concerning EU monetary policy, fared very poorly for Slovenia, but in general it fared very poorly for the whole euro area. It is in my view that the European Central Bank didn't respond to the crisis as it should at the very beginning. It led actually United States to respond in the right way with expansionary monetary policy. It actually, ECB led reevaluate or increase of euro, the value of euro against dollar, even against yuan. So that was very detrimental for the whole euro area, and Slovenia is, as a really open economy with a lot of exports, was suffering from that because trading partner countries were ailing in GDP growth. So on one side, I would say that the European Union didn't do its job very well until lately. Lately, I think.
You've sent the letter to Mr. Trichet, have you?
We were confronted with him in ECB and trying to persuade him, but it was in vain. So on this side, I think it was
why do you think that? Why do you think it was in vain? What was the problem?
I think the major was view of Germany.
Yeah, it's the first time, ladies and gentlemen, that we've mentioned the word Germany in this discussion. Some might ask why, but there we are. Anyway,
because it was beneficial for Germany.
Of course, no. I was just making a point about the primary importance of Germany and the German view of economic convergence, inflation busting, and budget discipline.
At that time, I think it was detrimental. Now, after this quantitative easing, I think their position is much more appropriate. Yes.
Minister, you're smiling. It's rare for a finance minister to smile.
We just got data yesterday.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We'll come back to you. I was struck by your diagnosis of the Slovenian economy and what was wrong, and you particularly said strong export sector, and basically kind of the real economy is not a problem. The problem is in the banks. Is that what you would, do you think that was the correct diagnosis?
So, thank you. In terms of the Slovenian economy, I'm the middle management. He's the boss, right? So
yeah, but this is the chance. This is a democracy. You can say what you like.
I mean, my view is I seem to be the only, sort of real sector person here on the panel at the moment. I share the most of the view. I think Slovenia has extremely competitive capabilities.
Yeah.
But I'm a very ambitious person. I think there are areas where we have to do a lot more.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't say I would disagree. I would, however, caution that it can't stop here. I would actually go on about the word competitiveness a little bit more, if you allow me.
Please,
because,
go ahead.
It hasn't been said a lot until now. I think Mr. Mramor mentioned it as the first one. And I think it's at the core of all of our problems, because we are still attributing a lot of time, at least in this region I would say so, to short-term, let's say, mandate, election-limited tactical circumstances, trying to make do of the upswings and growth, or trying to solve problems in the downturns, but they will always come and go. I think we should do more on the inherent competitiveness, on the underlying. And I think if you look at the examples from some other parts of the world, everybody likes to talk about Scandinavia sometimes, or Singapore, or countries like that. Or even if you want to discuss the point that Barcelona has one of the most competitive football teams while being a 2 million population, which is the same as Slovenia, there is something to be said about underlying competitiveness and working on it, but not for 2 or 3 or 5 years, but for 20. And I think the good examples have come from exactly cooperations and partnerships, but also vision, which at some times existed, and then those partnerships have been able to lead that vision for 20 years and not just for the term of one government or mandate or whatever. And I think this is where most of our challenges sometimes lie, because we devote not enough time to underlying competitiveness. Actually, I would even call it resilience from swings, because the swings will come. I mean, Slovenia can't do anything about what's going on in South America, China, or America, but it will affect us. So what we have to worry about is having our own resilience strengthened. And that, for me, is underlying competitiveness. It starts with great work in the schools, with the values, with the people. Education. And I think Slovenia has also done quite a lot on that, but there is still a way to go, and I think we're on the right track right now. I hope we continue.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sošic, perhaps it would be very interesting to hear your perspective from Croatia on just picking up any of the themes that have been described, because I'm not asking you to give a critique of the Slovenian economy. That comes afterwards.
No, central bankers in general like to talk about fiscal policy, particularly if there are ministers of finance who talk about monetary policy. But I will try to resist this temptation, and basically because what we see is a contribution of the monetary policy is to buy time for fiscal adjustment and structural reforms to take place. And I can elaborate a bit more on that later, but maybe since the...
Do you want to move the microphone just a little bit closer?
No problem, no problem.
Yeah, thanks.
So because the main topic of this panel is partnership, I will try to dwell a little bit on Croatian experience with the accession.
Please.
That's something you also mentioned, because we had some concerns about short term, not about the membership in general. We were happy because Croatia acceded finally into the EU as a last member state so far. But we had some concerns about short-term costs, because Croatia entered on its own. It left CEFTA, Trade Association, of which it was previously member state, and country was in the 5th or 6th year of recession. So we had some concerns about the negative impact, but it seems the experience proves that our concerns have been overblown. So our experts have been showing double-digit growth rates for the past 2 years, contributing to the growth, even if you account for statistical effects, for so-called Rotterdam-Antwerpen effect, because Croatia is, Croatia has the longest outside land border of the EU. So a lot of the trade takes place through Croatia, also the coast. Exports are increasing continuously and strongly. So obviously, and the strongest increase in exports we see with countries in the Central and Eastern Europe. So it clearly benefited Croatia immediately without the short-term downside that we feared a lot. Also, what's important for us is the access to structural funds. In the beginning, in the early phase, Croatia, our utilization of structural funds have been fairly poor. And now it's slowly picking up pace, and Croatia has recorded a few quarters of growth now. And what's important for us, what is important is to see growth in fixed investments. And this is probably linked also to the absorption of structural funds. So the productive capacity of the economy is expanding. So you see investments increasing and exports. So this is something good as it's healthy growth. And in perspective, what we see as important is linking with the pan-European cross-border production change, because countries that were best integrated into this pan-European production chains fared the crisis in the best possible way. So in Croatia, FDI companies account for about half of the export, depending how you count these companies. And in most other Central and Eastern countries, the share is about 70, 80, or even up to 90%. So we had a lot of FDIs, but not in the productive export sector. So we clearly need to link with our companies to link with other European producers. And also what we see as important, which is now gathering pace, is the regional mergers and acquisition activity. So this allows local producers to gain scale, to be more competitive on European market. So if you look at the partnership in the sense of structural reforms, I believe it's good because the dialogue with the Commission can give a bit of sense with prioritizing. If you engage in a real dialogue with the Commission, also Commission can take a little bit of the blame. Also, it's a bit dangerous game to play in, but you should not
Sounds as though
overplay.
you're playing a very dangerous game.
You should not overplay this.
You're a new member. Is this the way new members always behave?
Maybe it's a little bit, it's unavoidable against a very tough background, but it helps to push reforms. But what is very important is the ownership of the reforms. So just pushing reforms from the outside will not do. The country needs to understand these reforms are in the interest of the member state, and that it needs to push them on their own.
But just to be clear on something, I always draw a line in the European Union between countries that can actually use Europe as an insurance policy and as a way of selling the policy to the electorate. So I think that Italy falls into that crowd, Finland and Ireland to a degree. But if you told the British that they had to change their economic policy because Europe, it would be a disaster. So where does Croatia fit in that? Are you British or are you Italian?
Croatia had a track record of IMF arrangements in the 1990s. Right. Then we went through the very tough EU accession process, so the negotiations featured a number of both opening and closing bank benchmarks, so it was very heavily conditioned process. So Croatia is kind of used to conditionality, so I believe for us it's beneficial to have some kind of conditionality.
Oh, okay. So you're more Italian, but a bit British.
Push us a little bit, so it could be good because otherwise, the governments tend to say, like in fiscal issues, God give me chastity, but not
Saint Augustine.
Not yet.
Yes.
Of course. So, and in Croatia, with the fiscal issues, it was a very similar story. The same as reforms have been pushed a little bit down the road. In government, it's not that the government didn't do any adjustment. I mean, in the past couple of years, all items have been cut, expenditure of all items except interest payments and the costs arising from EU accession, because also EU accession, that's one real cost. It has substantial fiscal impact, so it's somewhere in the ballpark in the area of 1 to 1.5% of GDP. So it has we had to absorb these fiscal costs over the period of 2 years. So it was. So that's one area where we have seen very clear costs associated with EU membership. Although ultimately this should help you to have a more growth-friendly structure of budget expenditures. But you need to
good.
Be there.
That's very helpful. Thank you very much for the Croatian perspective. Richard, and then we're going to come to the ambassador as the crescendo. Richard, I wanted to bring in an Asia perspective here because you're a keen watcher of the Chinese economy, but also the Japanese economy, and we mustn't forget that Japan, for all its difficulties in the last few years, is still the third biggest economy in the world. It has higher living standards than in China, and it's an incredibly important economy. But you're also a student of China. So before we talk about partnership and international economic policy coordination, and whether that has a place now, can you give us an assessment, first of all, of how you see the problems in Japan with the extraordinary monetary policy? Are they making progress? Are we seeing perhaps a move out of improvement after 2 lost decades? And then perhaps a quick take on China.
Thank you very much for putting me into this panel. I think I was invited to these European panels because there's so many people in Europe today asking, are we going to be Japanese? Are we going to be Japanese? And I just want to set the record straight. Yes, Japan suffered from deflation, Japan stagnated, but the highest ever unemployment rate in Japan over the last 25 years was 5.5%. The average for the entire 25 years since the bursting of the bubble was 4.4%. So if you want to be like Japanese, 4.4% unemployment rate. Right now it's 3.4 or 3.3. Japan's GDP never fell below the peak of the bubble. It was always above the peak of the bubble, even though Japanese commercial real estate prices fell 87% nationwide. Not just a little corner of Tokyo, the entire country. So you can imagine what happened to the bank's balance sheets or household or business balance sheets. They're all underwater. But we managed to keep the GDP from collapsing because we happened to be blessed with this government party called Liberal Democrats, who are highly liberal with public spending. And so even though the private sector was still leveraging massively, absolutely massively, to the same scale that US fell into the Great Depression to that period, because government borrowed that money and put it back into the income stream, Japanese GDP never fell. And by 2005, because the government kept the GDP from falling, private sector had the income to repair its balance sheets. And 2005, balance sheets are repaired. And so I was hoping that, wow, okay, they're not going to be minimizing debt anymore. They're going to be maximizing profits like we learned in universities from 2005. Well, 2008, as you mentioned, Lehman Brothers collapsed. Japanese knew exactly what's going to happen to the rest of the world because they went through it all. They went on to the massive self-defense again. And the tsunami and the nuclear power accidents, they brought some of the savings down because they had to repair their factories. But even today, Japanese corporate sector is not borrowing money at 0 interest rates. We have the most willing bankers in the world who wants to lend the money, 0 interest rates, one of the lowest in the world, cleanest balance sheets in the private sector, and they still refuse to borrow. Why? 2 reasons. One is that when private sector goes through 10, 15 years repairing balance sheets, they become so sick of this experience that they'll say to themselves, never again. I never want to borrow money again. And I'm sure you are going to face this problem in this part of the world soon. Now people may not be borrowing because they're still repairing balance sheets. And every country in the Eurozone, if you look at how much the private sector is saving today, you'll be shocked at the numbers. Irish private sector saving over 7% of GDP, Spain 7.0, Portugal 6.8, Italy 4.8% of GDP, Slovenia 9.4% of GDP at zero interest rates. I mean, what kind of capitalism do we have when at zero interest rates, people are saving or paying down debt instead of borrowing money? Because after the bursting of the housing bubble, they want to repair their balance sheets. So we are completely outside the economic textbooks. We are in a world of what I call balance sheet recession, where they're minimizing debt instead. And after many years of this, I'm sure a lot of people will say to themselves, I never want to borrow money again. Americans who lived through the Great Depression, which was this type of recession, never borrow money until they died because the experience was so bad. We have a mini version of that in Japan, in that in the American case, because the government did not borrow the money, GDP actually fell 46%. So Americans had to pay down debt with 46% less income. That must have been living hell. In the Japanese case, GDP never fell, so people had the income to pay down debt, still took 15 years, and they're saying, never again. So we need a government policies, basically Abenomics is trying to get these people to borrow money again through trying to get the inflationary expectations up, try to implement accelerated depreciation allowances so that you can write off everything during the first year of your investments to get these people to borrow. So those measures are already in place. They haven't been all that successful yet, but that's what we are trying. And there's another reason why Japanese are not borrowing money, and that is Japan is chased from behind for the first time in history. The entire Japanese society since the Meiji Restoration over 100 years ago, Japan was chasing the West. Catch up with the West, chase with the West. So the entire employment system, the educational system, everything was designed to chase someone else. And that worked beautifully. So Japan caught up with a lot of the Western countries, went ahead of some of them. But now, we are chased by the Chinese. Just as dexterous, just as entrepreneurial, just as hardworking, and they're willing to work for a fraction of the Japanese wage. And the entire system designed to chase someone is not particularly good at fending off someone coming from behind. I mean, there was no rear-view mirror in Japan. Everybody's looking forward. Now, of course, Europe, United States are also chased by the Chinese as well. But you people, I don't know how it was in Slovenia, but at least the United States or Germany, UK, you have one experience already. And that's when you guys are chased by the Japanese. A lot of household appliances, manufacturers, a lot of things went out of business because of the Japanese in the 1970s. And I remember that time I was in the United States, and wow, Americans were such a sad people then, because I carry American passport by the way, we thought we'd beaten the Japanese in 1945, complete flatten the country, and then how come they're taking over every industry in the United States? A lot of people in the United States worry at that time that the United States would just become an agricultural supplier to Japan. And then they gone through a lot of structural reform called Reaganomics, trying to get the people to move, run faster. And finally, US regained some of the lost leadership. And I'm sure a lot of people in Western Europe also went through similar adjustments. But for Japan, this is the first time that it is chased from behind. And people are just as lost as the Americans were 30 years ago. I mean, for 30 years ago, remember, Japanese management was the most greatest thing on earth. People start saying, if you eat sushi, you're going to be as smart as the Japanese. All those crazy ideas were floated around that time. We're going through the same thing in Japan. And until they get the act together, that we are now being chased from behind, we just have to learn how to run faster. It's going to be very difficult to get the Japanese economy moving.
Yeah, excellent. And then a very brief answer before I turn to the ambassador. You say your two big points were Europe, watch out, you may well be on the way to being Japanified in terms of your low interest rates and high savings. But second, you're being chased behind by China. But hasn't the Chinese runner stumbled?
Well, China passed through, well, the ambassador can fill me on this, what I believe is the Lewis turning point. And for those of you who studied economics, I'm sure you know what Lewis turning point is. Lewis turning point is when all the workers in the countryside are fully integrated into the city's factories. Because all the countries start as an agrarian society before it becomes an industrial society. And my sense, and there's a lot of debate in China still, whether that point was actually passed, or if they change some rules, maybe we can still get some more workers from the countryside. But my sense is that it passed around 2012. When once you pass that point, then there's no more extra workers in the countryside, wages start rising very rapidly. China reached that point around 3 years ago, in my view. Then, working age population in China also starts shrinking on the same year, 2012, according to the Chinese definition. So two things suddenly happen at the same time. You pass the Lewis turning point, now the labor supply curve is very much upward sloping, wages going up very sharply, and then at the same time, the entire labor supply curve is shifting to the left, which pushes wages even higher. And that's a very different world from the world before you reach the Lewis turning point. Before you reach the Lewis turning point, if the government provides all the infrastructure, necessary things, companies from abroad, companies from China, they will invest, and then you grow. But once you pass the Lewis turning point, you cannot use the same model anymore. And I understand the Chinese policymakers are fully aware that from this point onward, because the labor supply is shrinking, you have to increase the productivity of individual workers for the country to grow. And that's much harder challenge for an authoritarian state like China, because that means you have to deregulate the economy, bring in much more market forces to work, so that individual workers, the resources will be allocated more efficiently. And they are working hard at it, and they're starting with the right place, financial market. If you deregulate the financial market first, money start going to most promising industries. That industry can pay higher wages, then good people will be attracted to those industries, and then that's the way you get the economy moving.
Good. I think it's time to allow the ambassador to speak, and it must be said that whatever China's problems at the moment, the historic achievement of the move towards a market economy and the lifting of tens of millions of people out of poverty is unchallenged. But some of the recent events have shown a slightly different picture. And perhaps one of the things, and this is just an observation, Ambassador, I don't expect you necessarily to respond, is that we have this image of the Chinese Mandarin elite, or the elite, that are these very, very talented, the best people, the best brains, and that they're somehow infallible, that they know best, and that they can control, and that they can achieve the outcomes expected. And the way in which the authorities committed substantial amounts of resources and prestige to attempts to stop the bubble bursting, that I think, I'm just offering an observation here, perhaps felt by some in the audience, that surprised some people in the rest of the world. But Madam Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lionel. I have to confess that I'm no economist and I'm no expert to talk about the subject in front of us. Still, I wish to share with the audience my humble laywoman observation about the topic of the day. Lionel, I think you made many pertinent points during your opening remarks. and also during your latest intervention. Well, I believe that the central theme for this strategic forum is partnership. And it is also the thread running through all the previous platforms. And for this panel's discussion, I think the focus is on reform, growth, and partnership. Well, I think these are also key words watched closely by the international community. Indeed, just as Lionel, you said just now, after the international economic financial crisis, the world is still undergoing a very complex and difficult period. And the recovery is slow and difficult. And I think the picture right now is very mixed. Well, in the past, we say that the developed world was on relative decline, whereas the newly emerging economies were relatively on the rise. But I think right now the picture is quite mixed. There is discrepancies in terms of economic recovery and economic policy within the developed world, and this is the same case with the newly emerging markets. But I think the core of all the efforts is about how to find new growth points, how to reform, how to shift from the old model of development to new ones. Well, in this respect, the economic performance of China and its future prospect is really of concern. Well, we say China is the second largest economy in the world, whereas in Brussels, I'm very often challenged by the EU because the EU believes it is the second largest economy in the world, whereas China is the third. But nonetheless, China is one of the big economies in the world. And just now you mentioned about who is important, Greece or China. Well, we believe Greece is important because we do not look at Greece in isolation. We put this in perspective. We believe that the settlement of the Greece debt crisis is in relation with the overall interest of the EU. Its destiny is closely connected with that of the EU. So we believe it is also about the EU's future, the EU's overall interest. That's why when Prime Minister Li Keqiang went to Brussels to attend the 17th China-EU summit about a month ago, the first message that he shared with our European friends was that China is firmly behind the EU in tackling the Greece debt crisis, and China is fully supportive of the European integration, and we believe that a prosperous, united, and strong EU and European integration is not only in the interest of 500 million people, but that of China and the world as a whole. Well, coming back to China, well, I think every year since the late 90s, somewhere in the West, there have been voices warning that China's success is unsustainable, that China's economy is built on sand and will end in tears. And at times of obvious difficulty, these voices could be more strident, and China disaster books would proliferate. And even in good times, China disaster stories could be in the headlines. While these concerns and worries could be appreciated, I think some of them, they do not reflect the real picture, or they could distort the real picture. What then are the real situation and the future prospect of China? I think I wish to share with you the following from a Chinese perspective. It is very true that after the international financial crisis that we on purpose decided to slow down. Because we believe that the international financial crisis not only brought challenges to Europe, to the United States, but also to China, because it also laid bare that our economic growth model remains insufficient. And also the dividends of the past rounds of reforms are waning. So we must change, and we must shift from the old model, from quantity to quality, and from scale to efficiency. And we must push ahead with reform, and we must make sure that our people benefit from the dividends of reform and of our development. So I can say that on the whole, the Chinese economy is steady and is moving in the right direction. We have ensured continuity and improvements of macroeconomic policies and the economic performing within an appropriate range. GDP grew by 7% in the first half of the year, and with our national economy standing at $6 trillion US, the 7% growth is still actually larger than the previous years. And we're contributing to 25% of growth rate of the world. And CPI growth is moderate, and employment remained robust. And in the first half of the year, we created 8.4 million new urban jobs. And major economic data of the second quarter, such as industrial output, investment, consumption, and export, have stabilized and rallied. And the market confidence has been strengthened. Though trade, investment, and industry dropped in July, consumption, real estate, and services remain stable. And what is important to note is that there is a change in the structure of the economy. And while some parts of the economy are slowing, others are growing strongly. So the economic structural adjustment and innovation-driven development have picked up speed. The services sector now accounts for more than half of the economy, and new products, new sectors, and new business models have emerged in great numbers. So in the first 5 months of the year, online retail sales rose by almost 39%, and output of new energy cars and industrial robots increased by 2.8 times and 1.3 times respectively. And all these points to the fact that China's industrial development is upgrading and the Chinese economy is being driven by new engines, new drivers. Well, there's no denying that China is faced with downward pressure, and some deep-seated problems remain. But as Premier Li Keqiang said, these are growing pains. Well, we believe that we have full confidence and capabilities to meet the target set for the year, and we will strive to sustain mid to high rate of growth and move the Chinese economy toward mid to high level or high end of development. Well, then I'll talk about the future. We have full confidence just now, I said, because our confidence is rooted in the following. First, as Lionel just now mentioned, we have a very strong, powerful, strategically minded, far-sighted, extremely committed, and determined, and action-oriented leadership. That is very important. And secondly, in our case, we have a well-functioning system, and we have unity of mind, unity of purpose, and unity of action. And also, we are very strong on implementations, and our development also enjoys sufficient driving forces and is highly resilient, and we have sufficient space for expansion. We have a huge market and tremendous resilience and a great potential to leverage. And also, our people are among the most hardworking and talented, and the quality of the working force is being improved. And every year, we produce some 7 million new graduates of universities. So there's a huge reservoir of talents. And China also has built up the most comprehensive industrial structure in the world. And we have a very good infrastructure as well. And we have also accumulated sufficient capital and technology to sustain our development. And also, the unbalanced development between regions, between urban and rural, are challenges as well as opportunities. So there's right now the urbanization percentage of China is 54.8. So it's lower than the average standards of the developed world. So by 2020, we'll move another 100 million people from the countryside to the cities. And we will lift another 100 million people out of poverty. And we will provide housing for another 100 million people. So that all these means opportunities, means investment, means growth. And besides, China continues, what is very important, continues our comprehensive deepening reform. China is the biggest beneficiary of reform. So we will continue to go ahead with our comprehensive reform. And China also remains open to the rest of the world, because we develop ourselves not in isolation. We open our doors to the outside, so we will keep our doors wider. So these are all the rationale behind our confidence. Well, personally, I believe that China's continuous success, of course, mainly relies on China's own effort. But I also believe that China's success is also reliant on partnership, on close coordination, cooperation, and collaboration between China and its partners, because we are in this economically globalized world. We are really becoming interdependent, and our interests are intertwined. So not only China has to adapt to the new normal, to this mid to high speed of growth, mid to high end of development, the rest of the world also needs to adapt. So in this regard, I'm heartened by the fact that though some European enterprises are concerned about their future operation in China, about their profit making, but over 50% of them, well, at least in China, believe that China continues to be among the top 3 most important market internationally.
Thank you. I'm just conscious that that was a very comprehensive answer to my question, and I appreciate that. And I think what you've said is very important. I did have one little comment before opening to the audience, because I think we've got a little time left for questions. But it did occur to me, Madam Ambassador, that in 2008-9, China played a very important partnership role in helping the rest of the world manage the global financial crisis. Chinese entities took stakes in Wall Street banks. China also reflated its economy with a massive credit expansion, massive domestic pump priming exercise. And it just occurred to me that it might be helpful. I'd be interested what the minister from Slovenia or Michael Noonan from Ireland, that wouldn't it be a good idea if somehow in the West we could say today China may have some difficulties, but we believe the underlying economy is sound. Would that be a good idea? What happened if the US Treasury Secretary was to say something like that? What do you think? I think it's time for the domestic host.
I think that would be a very good idea. I mean, I believe that the fundamentals in China are sound. I believe that they're adjusting their model from an economy that was driven by the export of low-cost manufactured goods to an economy that is developing the domestic market. And a developed domestic market certainly suits Ireland, because fundamental to our model is export-led growth. And if you don't have customers willing to buy, you're not going to sell on the export market. As well as that, I think while the uncertainty remains, there'll probably be extra liquidity in Europe, and it'll make it easier for us to service our debt. And overall, I would prefer to see a stable Chinese situation, because like Slovenia, if the cutting edge of our economy is exporting, then a country the size of China, with such a large proportion of world trade in the hands of the Chinese authorities, anything that diminishes growth worldwide reduces the potential for countries like Ireland and Slovenia to export. So while there might be some short-term gains, you know, in terms of less demand for commodities and reduced prices of energy and so on, I would like to see a statement along the lines you suggest, because certainly in the medium term, it's in everybody's interest internationally that China is secure, stable, out of the economic news, with a general belief that it will continue to grow at 7% or so.
It will be very short because Michael already said what I wanted to say, but I would just like to add that I hope Ambassador is right, as I was right for Slovenia concerning fundamentals. She supported it with a lot of arguments. We are nervous about the situation at the moment because of the reasons that Michael pointed out. For Slovenia, this is extremely important. Not that we would export that much directly to China, or that trade would be that big, but indirectly through other European countries. So hopefully this is true what you said, Mrs. Ambassador, and I would really like China to grow further.
Thank you. Any questions? And I realize we're running a bit short of time. It's been a long discussion, and but I wanted to make sure that the panelists who have deep experience were able to talk of this. So here we are. Yes, Madam. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Angela Wilkinson. I'm the Strategic Foresight Counsellor for the OECD. And last night I ran a session on looking forward. And I would like to ask the panelists about this question of partnership and fitness in a very different future than a past. It seems to me that we've been talking and reflecting on lessons about how do you prepare for a 100-meter sprint, and yet our economies are about to face a triathlon. We're not just having to focus on growth, we have to focus on the inclusiveness of growth, we have to focus on the greenness of growth, we have to prepare for a world of accelerating and more uncertain technology. So my question is, what new forms of partnership do we need, not to prepare for a 100-meter sprint, but for a triathlon?
Okay, Isabel. And then, please. Yeah. Okay. Anybody on the panel actually do triathlon? No? Okay.
Yeah, you're perfectly right that the sprint and the marathon do not require exactly the same capabilities and the same training. Now, on new forms of partnership, our impression is that what we are used and what we are laying the ground to will bear its fruit also for the marathon or the half marathon, if you prefer. And in particular, we think that you mentioned green growth and inclusive growth, but also above all sustainable growth, which actually brings me a little bit to the point you raised when you used the word competitiveness, which is again a word that can be used in and resilience can be used in different senses. And indeed, what we have to put in place is the necessary conditions for growth potential going forward. Now, you've probably watched all this discussion about secular stagnation, yes or no, the uncertainty about technological developments. Are we doomed to leave a low growth for the years to come? I'm not sure that we have a clear answer here, but what we certainly know is that if we don't try to act on the factors that determine, I mean, what technically we would call total factor productivity, some of which actually also help very much address some aspects of shorter-term demand shortage and the synchronization of business cycles, we won't be able to get there. I think that there are certain areas where we really have to push forward, and I was thinking about the digital single market or the digital markets, which in the EU we would call we address through the digital single market strategy, which is certainly going to be a very important instrument in unleashing a certain potential, both technological, but in terms of business models, which we see changing very, very rapidly. I'm not so sure whether the collaborative economy is going to be the answer, but it's certainly an element that seems to be developing. So I would say that partnerships or common understanding of the actions that need to be taken there are important, and I would expect that the forthcoming digital single market strategy would be an important response.
Okay, Janko, do you want to quickly come in, and then somebody else?
Well, the responsible growth was exactly what I was trying to say, and I think that if you view it globally, and I very much believe that China will, continue the convergence in both earning per capita, if you will, as well as in terms of how the business models are going to change. And just like a tennis player who in the first 15 years gains the speed of the service from very slow to very fast, then in the next 10 years of the professional career on a very high level, the speed of the service doesn't change, but the quality of the game might still be changing. So I think it's perfectly normal that there are changes in the speed. That doesn't mean that the trust in China or in effect in any other part of the world would diminish in this respect in terms of economic growth. What I see is that I would like to see Africa be next, if we're talking globally. I mean, and there are some other parts of the world where if we really want to have a world which is resilient to volatility, which usually ends, or at least is for a time very bad, then we would have to think and talk about a responsible growth. And in my view, this is only possible through partnerships globally, because, well, every other scenario that I can think of which will be able to balance the growth of population being larger than the growth of productivity globally, every other scenario is very bad, unfortunately, and we wouldn't like to see it. It's been seen in the past. So I can simply just subscribe to the fact that both on the micro level, for us as NLB being the leading bank in this country and a significant bank in the region, partnership in the digital revolution or the digital evolution is going to be key, because none of us can adapt and adopt the new technologies as quickly as we were maybe able some time ago. So partnerships are going to be key both on the micro level as well as on the global level in my respect. And it's actually going to have to become a new way of thinking, in a way.
Well, I'm conscious of time. I probably haven't devoted enough, if I'm going to engage in some self-criticism here, enough on the new ideas forward, but I'm a bit of a traditionalist. I think that institutions actually matter, and the institutions of the European Union have played a role. They may have made one or two policy errors, but they've played an important role in managing this terrible financial crisis. I also think that there are some examples of real political courage that matter. And you've seen some new leaders in Europe take those choices, tough choices, that have made a difference. And I think that we can also learn from lessons from outside. I was very concerned about Japanification of Europe. Not because I love the Japanese, it's just I don't like the growth rates. You can come in very quickly.
The unemployment rates.
Unemployment, I got it. It's only 4.5% over the last 20 years.
Well, per capita Japanese growth was not bad at all during this entire 25 years. But the population was shrinking. That's why the GDP didn't look all that great. Yes. And one point that I do want to talk about institutions is that the Maastricht Treaty says the government can only borrow 3% of GDP when the private sector is saving so much more than 3% of GDP. That part needs to be changed.
Yes.
Because that Europe can learn from the Japanese experience. Americans have learned from the Japanese experience. That's why they use the term fiscal cliff to keep the United States from falling off the fiscal cliff. In Europe, all the countries fell off the fiscal cliff, and no one is even talking about it. And that's very, very disturbing or frustrating from the Japanese perspective, because if you could only learn from how we fell off the fiscal cliff in 1997, Europe could have avoided all that mistake as the Americans managed to avoid repeating the Japanese mistake.
I think that's very well put, Richard, very well put. And I'd also then single out what the Madam Ambassador said about the Chinese experience. Some important insights there. So we come to a close. It's my job to thank the panel, ask you to thank the panel, and then announce that the next panel in this hall is at 11:30. It's Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership and the Transatlantic Value Chain, moderated by Dr. Isabel Grilo. Thank you.